Luke was drowning in a sea of shadows, where the sounds of real life were a distant echo, unable to penetrate the void that had settled in his soul. The accident had torn a gash in the fabric of his existence, as if fate had cruelly ripped away the notes of a melody he had not yet finished composing. His wife, Helena, and his son, Matthew, had vanished in the blink of an eye, and Luke, once a piano prodigy, could no longer hear the music that had always resonated in his heart. The world had become silent, colorless, and meaningless. He fled to the small coastal town of Mare Alta, a place where the wind whispered ancient secrets among the stones, and the sea seemed to lick the wounds of the earth. Luke chose this town for its obscurity, a forgotten point on the map where no one knew him, where he could disappear. His home was a solitary cabin at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by a dense forest, with the ocean roaring in the distance, as if it shared his silent pain. There, he sank into a purposeless routine, an endless cycle of waking, breathing, existing, and sleeping. The piano, once his most faithful companion, was now covered with a dusty cloth, its keys motionless, silent, like a tomb that no one dared to open. Luke avoided it as if each key were a stone, heavy and cold, representing a moment he could no longer bear. He used to play for Helena every night, improvising melodies that reflected love, happiness, and sometimes the small frustrations of life. Now, these melodies were locked away in his mind, kept as a painful memory he refused to relive. That day, the sky was covered with gray clouds, and the rain poured down in torrents, beating against the cabin's windows like insistent fingers, demanding attention. Luke sat at the kitchen table, an untouched coffee in front of him, his hands wrapped around a cup that gave no warmth. He stared at the wall, but saw nothing beyond the emptiness. His eyes, once full of life, were dull, lifeless, as if the light within him had been extinguished. He missed Helena with every breath, in every moment of silence that filled the air around him. She was his north, his sun amid the storm. Matthew, his son, was the melody of laughter that filled their home, the sound of light footsteps running through the living room, the sweet voice asking to hear a bedtime story. Now, all of that was just a memory, painful and sharp, that he tried to suffocate every second. Luke stood up from the table, slowly walking to the window. He watched the rain slide down the glass, creating random patterns, like tears that flowed aimlessly until they disappeared into nothingness. Outside, the forest swayed under the wind, as if whispering secrets he could no longer hear. He closed his eyes, wishing the silence would consume him, that the void would swallow him whole. To him, the world had nothing left to offer. But there was something Luke couldn't control. Despite his desire to sink into silence, life continued to whisper around him. The sound of the rain, the rustling of the leaves, the distant roar of the ocean. All these small sounds insisted on existing, like a stubborn melody that could not be erased. Even though he didn't want to admit it, the world was still alive, and somewhere inside him, the music still existed, waiting to be heard. In that moment, a fragile and solitary note began to form in his mind, a memory of times gone by. But Luke quickly pushed it away, afraid of what that note might bring with it. He wasn't ready to listen, wasn't ready to feel. So, he turned away from the window, returned to the darkness of his house, trying to escape the music that still insisted on whispering in his soul. The silence, however, was not the void he desired. It was a prelude, a pause before something greater, something inevitable, and Luke, though unaware, was about to embark on a new journey, where the silence would be just the beginning. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun slowly sank into the horizon, turning the sea into a mirror of liquid fire. Mare Alta, with its narrow streets and old houses, was bathed in a golden light that gave the town a charmingly mysterious air, as if time itself had slowed down to watch the spectacle of twilight. Luke, however, saw none of this. To him, the world was a faded canvas, devoid of brightness or meaning, a landscape that existed only because he was still breathing. He had left his house that afternoon without any clear purpose, driven by a restlessness that consumed him. His steps led him to the small square in the town center, where an ancient fountain, its sculptures worn by time, poured water like eternal tears. Around him, the shops were beginning to close their doors, while the locals said their lazy goodbyes with waves, their voices muffled by the gentle breeze blowing in from the sea. Luke sat on a wooden bench, distant from the fountain, letting his gaze wander unfocused. There was something comforting about that square, a tranquility that contrasted with the storm inside him. But the silence he so desperately sought was constantly interrupted by the murmur of water and the distant laughter of children still playing in the street. It was then that he saw her. A woman with dark, long hair, tied in a messy ponytail, was crossing the square with a light, almost floating urgency, as if her feet barely touched the ground. She carried a large bag, overflowing with papers and sheet music that fluttered with her steps. Luke tried to look away, but something about her made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the way she smiled at the children running around her, or the almost palpable energy that emanated from her, as if she were made of pure light in the midst of the twilight. Sophie was late, as usual. Her life was a whirlwind of musical notes and tight schedules, but she loved every second of it. As a music teacher at the local school, Sophie dedicated her days to inspiring children to find their voice through music, believing that every chord, every melody, could change someone's world. Today, she had spent hours rehearsing with a group of students for a community performance, and now she was rushing to her last appointment of the day. As she passed by the bench where Luke was sitting, Sophie felt something strange, like a small electric shock running down her spine. She stopped, her smile fading as her eyes captured the solitary figure before her. He was still, like a forgotten statue, but there was something in his eyes, a sadness so deep and dense that it almost took her breath away. Sophie hesitated, her instincts as a teacher and caregiver screaming at her to do something, but she didn't know this man. He seemed so distant, as if he were miles away, even though he was only a few feet from her. But something, perhaps the same force that made her run all over town with a bag full of musical dreams, made her take a step forward. "Hi," she said, her voice soft but firm, breaking the silence between them. Luke didn't respond immediately, his eyes slowly moving in her direction, as if emerging from a deep trance. When their gazes finally met, Sophie saw the pain he carried, a pain so intense that it seemed etched into every line of his face. "Are you okay?" she asked, stepping a little closer but keeping a respectful distance. She knew she couldn't invade his space, but she also couldn't just walk away. Luke didn't know how to respond. No one had asked him if he was okay in so long because everyone already knew the answer. He almost laughed, but the sound died before reaching his lips. "I'm trying," he murmured, almost to himself. Sophie nodded, understanding more than he realized. "Sometimes that's all we can do," she said with a gentle smile. "But trying is a good start." She didn't expect a response and didn't get one. Instead, she pulled a piece of paper from her bag and quickly wrote something on it, folding it and handing it to Luke. "If you ever want to try something new," she said, with a mischievous light in her eyes, "come here." And with that, she turned away, leaving him alone again, but somehow less lonely. Luke opened the paper after she left. It was the address of the local music school, along with a hastily scribbled sentence. Asterisk, music can heal even the deepest wounds. Come and find out. Asterisk. He closed the paper slowly, feeling a spark of something he thought had been lost forever. Curiosity. And maybe, just maybe, hope. Luke woke up that morning with a strange feeling, as if the oppressive weight that had settled over him in recent months was somehow shifting, allowing a small ray of light to penetrate his darkness. The paper Sophie had given him in the square was folded on the kitchen table, next to his coffee cup, a silent reminder of something he still didn't understand. He had read those words so many times that he could almost recite them by heart. Asterisk, music can heal even the deepest wounds. Come and find out. Asterisk. For hours, he hesitated, pacing back and forth in the small cabin, Sophie's words echoing in his mind like a persistent refrain. There was something in the simplicity of that phrase that disturbed him, a challenge disguised as an invitation. Music had been his life before. Now, it was a painful memory, a tightrope he feared to walk again. And yet, something inside him, a part he thought was dead, began to stir. Without thinking much, Luke grabbed the paper, put it in his pocket, and walked out the door, as if the movement itself could silence the voices in his head. The town of Mare Alta was bathed in the soft light of autumn, with leaves beginning to turn golden on the trees along the narrow streets. There was a stillness that morning that matched his state of mind, a calm before something he could not yet name. He arrived at the music school, an old building with stone walls covered in ivy. It was modest, almost hidden among the other buildings around it, but there was a charm about it that Luke couldn't ignore. The laughter of children echoed through the courtyard, mingling with the sound of instruments being tuned, creating a curiously harmonious cacophony. Luke paused at the entrance, his heart beating faster than he would have liked to admit. What was he doing here? Why had he come? Before he could turn and leave, Sophie appeared in the hallway, as if she knew he was there. Her smile was wide, warm, almost disarming. "You came," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Luke shook his head, still uncertain. "I don't know why." Sophie shrugged, gesturing for him to follow her. "Maybe you don't need to know right now. Sometimes, the answers come with time." She led him down a hallway to a room in the back, where the walls were covered with children's drawings and sheet music. In the center, an old grand piano was partially covered by disordered sheets of music, as if it had been left in the middle of a whirlwind of creativity. Luke hesitated at the door, his gaze fixed on the instrument he had avoided for so long. "This is our treasure," Sophie said with a smile. "The kids love it, but lately, it's been needing someone who really knows how to make it sing." Luke felt a lump in his throat. I'm not sure I can." "You don't have to be sure," she replied, with a calmness that contrasted with the storm he felt inside. "Just sit down, play a note, if you want, or stay silent. What matters is that you're here." Reluctantly, Luke approached the piano, as if each step was a plunge into unknown waters. He slid his hand over the wooden lid, feeling the texture beneath his fingers, as if the instrument had been waiting for him all this time. He sat down on the bench, his eyes fixed on the keys that, until recently, had been his most intimate confidants. For a long moment, he just sat there, motionless, listening to the sounds around him. The children's laughter, the wind outside, the faint hum of an old light bulb in the ceiling. Then, almost without thinking, he let his fingers fall onto a single key. The note rang out, clear and pure, reverberating through the space like a contained scream that had finally found its freedom. That single note was like an awakening. Suddenly, Luke felt something break inside him, a dam he had built with such care beginning to give way. His hands started to move, hesitant at first, but then with a fluidity he hadn't experienced in a long time. The notes flowed from his hands as if they had been waiting for this moment, an improvised melody that seemed to form from his own emotions, weaving a tapestry of sound that echoed within him. Sophie, watching from a distance, saw the light in Luke's eyes change. It was no longer dull, no longer lost. There was something there, a spark, small and fragile, but undeniable. She knew this was only the beginning, that Luke's wounds wouldn't be healed in an instant, but that moment, that melody, was a step. A first step towards something he thought he had lost forever. When Luke stopped playing, there were tears in his eyes, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, feeling their weight dissipate. Sophie approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Music has that power," she whispered. "It can break us, but it can also put us back together." Luke took a deep breath, still feeling the echo of the notes on his skin. "I need to keep going," he said, with a new determination in his voice. And Sophie just smiled, knowing he was on the right path. Music began to seep back into Luke's life, like the tide that slowly and inexorably returns to cover the sand after the ebb. Each day at the music school was a step away from the darkness that had swallowed his soul. But, as he would soon discover, the past does not let itself be buried so easily. With every new melody he played, with every chord that resonated within the old music room's walls, Luke felt something stir inside him. A latent pain, like an old wound beginning to reopen. That afternoon, the room was bathed in a golden light streaming through the dusty windows, casting long, ethereal shadows. The children had already left, leaving behind only the sound of their laughter echoing through the empty halls. Luke remained seated at the piano, his fingers still resting on the keys, hesitant. Sophie had stepped out for a few minutes, leaving him alone with his thoughts and with the piano. As he played a soft melody, a piece he had improvised for the children earlier, the notes began to intertwine with memories he was not ready to relive. The memories emerged like specters, floating in the air around him, heavy and suffocating. He saw Helena, his wife, sitting beside him, her eyes closed as he played for her in the living room of their old home. She used to rest her head on his shoulder, listening to each note as if it were a secret he shared only with her. And then, the image of Matthew, their son, running through the room, laughing and asking him to play faster, louder. These memories, once sweet and comforting, now felt like sharp knives, cutting him from within. Luke felt the music in his hands begin to falter, the notes becoming dissonant, reflecting the turmoil growing inside him. The room around him seemed to close in, the walls drawing nearer, the air growing heavier. He tried to push the memories away, but they clung to him, persistent, insistent. Suddenly, the melody changed, almost without him realizing it. His fingers, guided by pain, began to play a piece he had composed for Helena years ago. It was a melody laden with love, with promises that now seemed hollow. The music filled the room, but instead of bringing relief, it intensified the weight in his chest. Each note was a reminder of what he had lost, of the life he would never have again. The tears began to fall, silent and warm, streaming down his face as he played. Luke was alone in that moment, lost in a sea of sorrow that threatened to drown him. He could see Helena's face, her bright eyes, her laughter. He could hear Matthew's voice, asking him to tell a bedtime story, his small hands holding his, so confident, so full of life. Luke abruptly stopped playing, his hands trembling over the keys. The room, which moments before had vibrated with music, was now steeped in an oppressive silence. It felt as though all the air had been sucked out of the space, leaving him suffocating, empty. The pain in his chest was unbearable, a pressure that seemed to have no end. He got up from the bench, nearly stumbling over his own feet, and left the room, the door slamming behind him with a sound that echoed through the halls. Luke walked quickly, almost running, trying to escape the memories, the piano, the music that now felt like his greatest enemy. He exited the school, the cool late afternoon air hitting him like a slap, but it wasn't enough to calm him. The sky was beginning to turn purple, and the first stars were appearing on the horizon, indifferent to his anguish. Luke kept walking aimlessly, his steps leading him to the beach, where the waves gently lapped at the shore. He stopped at the water's edge, the cold waves licking his feet, but he barely felt the chill. All he could feel was the pain, the guilt consuming him. He knelt in the sand, his hands buried in the damp ground, and finally allowed himself to be overtaken by sobs. The music, which he had used as an attempt to heal, had torn his wounds open again, exposing them to the ocean's cruel salt. In that moment, Luke realized that the journey he had begun by returning to the piano would be much more difficult than he had imagined. He would have to confront his demons, his painful memories, if he truly wanted to find peace. But for now, he could only lose himself in the pain, allowing the ocean to carry away his tears, hoping that one day, he too could be carried away, freed from the chains that kept him bound to the past. The air in the small music room was heavy with a tension that Luke couldn't ignore. It was a warm afternoon, and the windows were open to let in the sea breeze. But the wind did little to relieve the weight he felt on his shoulders. Since that moment on the beach, where he found himself crumbling under the weight of his memories, Luke had avoided the piano, as if the keys were portals to a past he wasn't ready to face again. Sophie, ever perceptive, noticed the change in him. She saw the way he avoided looking at the piano, as if the instrument had transformed into something threatening. That afternoon, after the children had left and silence reigned in the school, Sophie decided it was time to act. She knew Luke was pulling away again, letting the darkness drag him down, but she also knew he was still holding onto the edge, that there was still a chance to bring him back. She entered the music room and found him sitting on a bench at the back, his eyes lost in some distant point, as far away as his emotions. Without saying a word, Sophie walked over to the piano and, with a deliberate motion, removed the sheet music from the keys, leaving them exposed. The soft rustling of the paper echoed in the space, drawing Luke's gaze to her. "Play," she said, her voice firm but gentle. Luke shook his head, already feeling the fear and pain return. "I can't, Sophie. Every time I try, I just feel everything. All of it again." She moved closer, her eyes locked on his, filled with a determination and compassion that disarmed him. "I know it hurts, Luke. I know playing brings up all the memories you're trying to bury. But that's exactly why you need to play." He looked at her, confused and a bit irritated. "Do you think it's easy? Do you think it's just sitting down and playing? Like that would fix anything?" Sophie didn't back down. Instead, she sat beside him on the bench, her presence an anchor in the chaos he felt. "I don't think it's easy, Luke. I know it's not. But running away isn't easy either. And you know that. Music. Music has always been your way of connecting with the world, with the people you love. It's a part of you. And now, more than ever, you need it." Luke felt her words resonate within him, but the resistance was still there, strong and fierce. "But what if I play and everything falls apart again? What if I can't handle it?" Sophie sighed, her expression softening as she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Look, music has the power to heal, but it can also break us. And that's exactly what you need to face. You need to break, so you can rebuild. If the music makes you fall apart, let it rebuild you too. That's the challenge, Luke. It's not about playing a perfect melody. It's about playing what's inside you, no matter how painful it is." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meanings. Luke looked at the keys, his heart racing. He knew Sophie was right. He knew avoiding the piano was avoiding himself, avoiding the healing process that, no matter how painful, was necessary. But the fear was still there, deep-rooted, a constant shadow. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. "I have a proposal," she said, her tone shifting to something lighter, almost challenging. "You teach me one of your compositions. It doesn't have to be one of the old ones. It can be something new, something you feel right now, in this moment. And together, we'll play that music. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real." Luke looked at her, surprised by the suggestion. The idea of teaching Sophie, of creating something new, something not tainted by past memories, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. He pondered, thoughts racing through his mind, as he looked at the piano, which seemed to be waiting for him, silent and patient. "Come on, Luke," Sophie insisted, smiling encouragingly. "Play for me. Show me what's inside you, without fear. I'm here, by your side." Luke took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm within. Finally, he reached out his hands, his fingers hovering hesitantly over the keys. He closed his eyes and, in a movement that seemed to require all his courage, pressed the first note. The sound echoed in the room, soft and melancholic, but filled with a truth he could no longer deny. Sophie watched, feeling the tension slowly ease as Luke allowed the music to begin flowing. It wasn't a cheerful melody, but it was honest, a pure expression of everything he was feeling. And as she prepared to play alongside him, she knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in Luke's life. A chapter where he would finally face the ghosts of his past, turning pain into music, one note at a time. The first notes echoed through the room like fragments of a long-forgotten dream. The sound was fragile, hesitant, but at the same time carried a depth that seemed to resonate within the very walls of the space where Luke and Sophie sat. The piano keys, now familiar under his fingers, seemed almost to pulse with a life of their own, responding to Luke's touch as if they too had been waiting for this moment. The melody that emerged was nothing he had planned. It was a spontaneous flow of emotion, a current pulling him inward, exploring emotional territories he had avoided for so long. Sophie sat beside him, her hands gently resting on the keys, following his lead without trying to guide him. She was there as a support, a silent yet powerful presence that allowed him to explore without fear of getting lost. The music began to take shape, a composition that seemed to blend the pain of the past with the tentative hope of an unknown future. The notes were a dance between lament and resilience, a melody that told a story of loss but also of an inner strength Luke barely knew he possessed. And as he played, he felt as if each note was pulling a piece of buried pain from within him, bringing it to the surface, exposing it to the light. Helena's face appeared in his mind, as clear as the day he met her. Her smile, the way her eyes lit up when he played for her, the laughter they shared on sunny afternoons, all of it intertwined with the music, creating a sonic tapestry that was both beautiful and painful. But unlike before, Luke didn't try to push these memories away. He let them flow through him, allowing the music to be the medium for expressing everything he felt, without filters, without barriers. Sophie, sensing the intensity of the emotions Luke was expressing, began to play alongside him, complementing the melody with soft chords, almost like a whisper. It was a response to his music, a conversation between two hearts where words were unnecessary. She didn't know exactly what Luke was reliving, but she could feel the weight of his emotions in every note, and she did her best to soften the sharp edges of his pain with her own musical contribution. As the melody continued, something began to change within Luke. The pain was still there, but now it seemed to be part of something larger, something he could shape and transform. He realized that the music, which had once been a constant reminder of everything he had lost, was becoming a tool for healing. Each note he played was not just an echo of the past, but also a step toward the future, a future where he could carry the memories of Helena and Matthew without being crushed by them. And then, almost without realizing it, the melody began to change. The notes that had been melancholic started to take on a warmer, more vibrant tone. It was as if the music was guiding Luke out of the darkness, bringing him back into the light, where he could breathe again. Sophie, sensing this shift, smiled as she played, allowing her own style to adapt to the new direction of the music, adding layers of hope and renewal. The room was filled with sound, a wave of emotions that enveloped them both, but Luke no longer felt overwhelmed. He felt as though he was navigating through the music, finding a new balance between the past and the present, between pain and healing. When the last note sounded, reverberating softly before fading into the air, Luke realized he was breathing more easily than he had in a long time. He opened his eyes, which were full of tears, but this time, those tears weren't just of sadness. There was something more, something he couldn't fully define, but that he knew was important. Sophie, still beside him, looked at him with an expression of deep understanding, as if she knew exactly what he was feeling, even without a word being spoken. "It was beautiful," she finally said, her voice softly breaking the silence. "You're starting to find your voice again, Luke." He didn't respond immediately, but instead, he looked at the piano, at the keys that now seemed to shine with a new light. I feel like something has changed," he murmured, still processing the depth of what had just happened. "But I also feel like I'm just beginning." Sophie nodded, smiling at him with silent encouragement. "That's the point, Luke. Music isn't just about where you end up, but about the journey you take along the way. And you're on the right path. Keep playing, keep exploring. Let the music guide you." Luke took a deep breath, feeling a new determination grow within him. The first notes had been played, and he knew the journey ahead would be long and often painful. But for the first time in a long while, he was willing to continue, to move forward, one note at a time, toward a future where music and life could coexist in harmony. Music had begun to transform Luke, like a tide slowly sculpting the coastline over time. Each day brought a new melody, a new chord, a new layer of himself that he discovered through the piano keys. But as he advanced in his journey of healing, an old, hungry shadow started to stir in the depths of his mind. A presence he had kept at bay but now began to approach, slow and relentless. That morning, the sky over Mare Alta was gray, reflecting the restlessness Luke felt inside. The sea breeze that usually calmed him now seemed laden with foreboding, a cold whisper that made him shiver. He headed to the music school, trying to ignore the sense that something was about to unravel, but the discomfort persisted, a stone in the pit of his stomach that he couldn't dissolve. When he arrived at the school, he found Sophie in the music room, already busy organizing sheet music and preparing lessons for the children. She greeted him with her usual smile, but she noticed something was different about him. There was a stiffness in his movements, an absence in his eyes that she hadn't seen in a while. "Is everything okay?" she asked, concern clear in her voice. Luke opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the phone in his backpack began to ring. He froze at the sound, a ringtone he hadn't heard in months, a sound that seemed to belong to a life he had left behind. With trembling hands, he took the phone out of his backpack and looked at the screen. The name flashing in white letters was a direct hit to his chest, Jane. Jane was Helena's sister, and they hadn't spoken since the accident. The silence between them was an abyss, a chasm they were both afraid to cross. And now, out of nowhere, she was there, trying to reach him, bringing with her the memories he had tried so hard to bury. "Luke," Sophie called, but he was already far away, trapped in the storm forming inside his mind. Without answering, he left the room, the phone still vibrating in his hand, the sound echoing in his ears like an alarm bell. He walked out into the school courtyard, where the sea breeze blew strongly, almost as if it wanted to push him back inside, to safety. But Luke ignored the wind's plea and, with a tightness in his chest, answered the call. "Jane." His voice came out rougher than he intended, but there was a knot in his throat he couldn't untangle. "Luke." Jane's voice was heavy with emotion, a mix of sadness, anger, and something else, something he couldn't identify. "We need to talk." Those simple, yet heavy words fell on him like an avalanche. He knew this moment would come eventually, but that didn't prepare him for the impact. "What do you want, Jane?" he asked, trying to sound composed, but the tension was clear. I couldn't go on like this, not talking to you. I know you're trying to move on, but so am I. And there are things that need to be said, things that have been left unsaid since they were gone." Her voice broke at the end, but she quickly regained composure. "Do you have a moment?" Luke felt a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. Guilt, pain, anger, fear. He knew Jane was right. There were things left unsaid, wounds left untreated, but he also knew that facing them could drag him back into the dark abyss he had barely managed to escape. "Jane, he began, but was interrupted by her insistence. "Please, Luke. It's about Helena. It's about Matthew. I need answers, and I think you do too." Those words pierced him like a knife, and he felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. Images of the accident, the chaos, the blood, began to flood his mind, blurring the line between past and present. He could almost hear the screams, the sound of shattering glass, the overwhelming sense of helplessness. The shadow he had tried to ignore now loomed fully, a colossal, suffocating presence that enveloped him. I don't know if I can, Jane," he whispered, the painful confession slipping from his lips. Sophie, who had been watching from a distance, noticed the drastic change in Luke. Seeing him struggle to keep control, she approached slowly, her hand reaching for his in a silent gesture of support. "You're not alone in this, Luke," Jane continued, her voice now softer, almost pleading. "We need each other to get through this. Please, let me in." Luke looked at Sophie, his eyes reflecting the inner storm he was desperately trying to contain. There was a part of him that wanted to flee, to run away, to anywhere he wouldn't have to face the pain Jane was bringing to the surface. But another part, a small but growing part, knew that Sophie was right. He wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, facing that shadow was the next step in his journey of healing. "Jane," he finally said, his voice firm but still laced with emotion. "Let's talk. But know that I'm still trying to find my way. I'm not sure I have all the answers you're looking for." Jane's breath on the other end of the line seemed to ease, and Luke knew he had taken a small step, not toward the past, but toward the future, a future where he could finally start freeing himself from the shadow that had haunted him. "Thank you, Luke," Jane replied, her voice filled with gratitude and relief. "I just thank you." When he hung up the phone, Sophie was there, by his side, saying nothing, but offering silent comfort. Luke knew the real challenge was still to come, that the conversations with Jane would bring to the surface the ghosts he feared most. But he also knew that now, more than ever, he was ready to face them, to finally allow the past to find its place, no longer dominating his present. And as he looked out toward the horizon, where the gray clouds were beginning to dissipate, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. The air was thick in the small living room of Jane's house, as if the unspoken words hung in the air, creating an almost palpable tension. Luke had hesitated before crossing the threshold, feeling that each step he took toward this conversation was like walking into a fire he knew he had to walk through, even though the heat threatened to consume him. Jane sat in a worn armchair, her eyes fixed on a framed photograph she held in her hands. It was a picture of Helena and Matthew, taken on a sunny day at the beach, both of them laughing, their faces radiating happiness. The image was a cruel contrast to the darkness that had seeped into Luke's heart. He sat on the sofa across from her, his hands restless on his knees, struggling to find the words that seemed not to exist. "I look at this photo every day," Jane began, not taking her eyes off the image. "And every day, I wonder how everything changed so quickly. How we went from being a happy family to this." Her voice broke, but she quickly pulled herself together, as if forcing herself to stay strong. Luke didn't know what to say. The guilt he felt was a constant weight, an incessant reminder of everything he believed he had failed. "Jane, I'm sorry," he murmured, the words sounding weak and insufficient, like mere shadows of what he truly wanted to express. She finally lifted her eyes to him, and the pain in her gaze was like a direct blow to his heart. "Are you sorry, Luke? Really? Because to me, it seems like you just pulled away, ran from all of this, while I was left here, trying to piece together what was left." Luke took a deep breath, feeling the bitter truth in her words. "I know it was selfish of me, but I was lost. I didn't know how to deal with the pain, with the guilt. Isolating myself was the only thing I could do to keep from completely falling apart." Jane gripped the photograph tightly, as if she needed something to anchor her while navigating the turbulent waters of her emotions. "And what do you think I did? Do you think I didn't want to run away too? But I couldn't. Helena was my sister. Matthew was my nephew. They were part of me, and when you pulled away, it felt like I lost you too." The weight of guilt, always present, seemed to grow heavier, nearly crushing Luke under its burden. He knew he had failed Jane, just as he felt he had failed Helena and Matthew. But he also knew that in this moment, running away again was not an option. "I can't change what happened, Jane," he said, his voice full of regret. "But I'm here now, and I'm willing to face this, to face the truth, no matter how painful it is." Jane finally set the photograph aside, her eyes now fixed on his, hard but also filled with a desperate need to understand. "I just want to know, Luke. I just want to know what happened that day. Why were you driving? Why didn't you stop? Why did it all end like that?" The questions, fired like bullets, pierced Luke with renewed pain. He knew this moment would come, the moment when he would have to relive the worst day of his life, not just in his mind but out loud, sharing the burden with someone who had as much right to the truth as he did. He closed his eyes, trying to find the words, but all that surfaced were fragments of memory, disjointed images of broken glass, the sound of tires screeching on wet asphalt, the screams. We were arguing," he began, his voice trembling. "I was distracted. I wasn't paying attention to the road. It was raining, and everything happened so fast. I didn't see the car coming. And then, everything fell apart. In 1 second, they were there, and the next, they were gone." Jane closed her eyes, absorbing the words like blows. "You were arguing with Helena?" she asked, her voice lower, almost a whisper. "Yes," he replied, feeling the guilt tear at his insides. "It was a silly argument, about nothing really important. But I was frustrated. I couldn't let it go. And because of that, I lost control. I lost everything." The silence that followed was devastating, heavy with revelation and the unbearable weight of shared guilt. Jane slowly stood up, walking to the window, where she stared out, her back to Luke. He didn't know if he should speak, if he should try to explain more, or if he should just let the silence do what words could not. "Look," Jane finally said, her voice soft but filled with deep pain. "You've carried this guilt for so long. I've carried mine too. I've always wondered if I could have done something, said something, to prevent all of this. But deep down, I know that guilt doesn't bring them back. It doesn't heal us. It only destroys us, bit by bit." Luke felt a solitary tear roll down his cheek, one of many he had shed, but this one seemed to carry with it years of pent-up pain. "I know," he finally said, his voice hoarse, "but I don't know how to let it go, how to move on without being consumed by this guilt." Jane turned to him, her eyes still glistening with unshed tears, but also with a newfound determination. "Maybe we don't need to let go of the guilt," she said gently. "Maybe we just need to learn to live with it without letting it define us, without letting it push away the people who are still here. And maybe, just maybe, we can find some peace together." Those words, simple and true, fell on Luke like a bomb. For the first time in a long while, he felt he wasn't alone in his pain, that there was someone who understood, who shared the weight of the loss and the guilt. And in that moment, he knew that the journey he had begun, the journey through music, through forgiveness, through healing, was far from over. But with Jane by his side, he felt that perhaps, just perhaps, it was possible to find a path toward the light, where the past could be accepted and the future finally lived. The morning sun streamed through the window of the small music studio, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air as if celebrating a moment of renewal. The piano, now an inseparable companion to Luke, stood there, imposing and silent, as if patiently waiting for what was about to happen. Luke sat down on the bench, but something was different about him this time. He was no longer the man who hid from the notes, the memories, the pain. The confrontation with Jane had been the catalyst for a profound transformation, a kind of purification through tears and painful truths. For the first time in so long, he felt light, not because the guilt had disappeared, but because he had begun to accept it as a part of himself without letting it dominate his existence. He looked at the keys, recalling Sophie's words, the hours they had spent together composing, exploring the recesses of his soul through music. She was by his side, as always, ready to support him, but also to let him lead the way. Today, however, something was different. Today wasn't just another music session. Today was the day Luke would finally write the piece that had been forming inside him, a work that carried within it everything he had lived, all the pain, the joys, the losses, and above all, the renewal. With a deep breath, he placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The first notes came out hesitantly, like a child taking its first steps, but soon the melody began to flow with surprising clarity. There was no sheet music to guide him. Everything came directly from his heart, from his experiences, from his soul. It was a living composition, growing and transforming with each moment, a blend of lament and hope that filled the room with an almost palpable intensity. The music was like a conversation between the Luke of the past and the Luke of the present. At times, the notes were dark and heavy, reflecting the weight of grief and guilt he had carried for so long. At other times, they soared, light as the wind blowing over the hills of Mare Alta, carrying with them the promise of a new beginning. It was a battle between pain and healing, and each note seemed to affirm that, despite everything, life still pulsed within him. Sophie, sitting beside him and listening intently, felt a growing emotion within her. She knew she was witnessing something unique, the rebirth of a man through his art. Every chord, every melody, was like a confession, a release of the invisible chains that had kept him prisoner for so long. It was like watching a phoenix rise from the ashes, its wings glowing with the light of the rising sun, ready to fly once more. Luke continued to play, immersed in the creation. He brought forth memories of Helena and Matthew, but instead of being memories that destroyed him, they were now part of a larger tapestry, one in which love and longing intertwined harmoniously. The music became a tribute, an homage to them, but also a declaration that he would continue living, feeling, loving, despite everything. The piece he was composing was complex, full of layers and nuances. There were moments of deep melancholy, followed by passages of pure serenity, and then bursts of joy, as if life itself were celebrating its own resilience. Luke was in a state of creative ecstasy, and the music guided him, taking him to places within himself that he didn't even know existed. When the final note finally resonated in the room, it hung in the air for a long moment, like a silent prayer, before slowly dissipating, leaving a reverent silence in its wake. Luke, with his hands still resting on the keys, closed his eyes, feeling a peace he had never imagined possible. He had done the impossible. He had transformed his pain into something beautiful, something he could share with the world, something that healed him with every note. Sophie, with tears in her eyes, said nothing. She didn't need to. She knew that Luke had crossed through the darkness and emerged on the other side, stronger, more whole, more himself than he had ever been. Luke opened his eyes and looked at her, a soft, genuine smile lighting up his face. "I think I finally did it," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "I managed to turn all of this into something that makes sense, something that sets me free." Sophie nodded, holding his hand, a gesture of solidarity and support that needed no words. "You did it, Luke," she responded softly. "And now, this music is your gift to the world. And more importantly, to yourself." Luke took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs as if it were the first breath of a new man. He knew there would still be difficult days ahead, that the road before him would be long and full of challenges, but now he had something he hadn't had before. The certainty that he could face anything and still create beauty from the pain. In that moment, Luke was reborn, not as the man he had been before, but as someone transformed, shaped by the flames of adversity and strengthened by the power of music and love. And finally, he was ready to live again, with all the scars, all the memories, and all the hope that came with the new day. The night of the concert arrived like a gentle wave, bringing with it a mix of excitement and nervousness that hung in the air like static electricity. Mare Alta, that small coastal town so accustomed to tranquility, seemed to pulse with a new, different energy. Everyone knew that something special was about to happen that night, and at the center of it all was Luke, ready to share not just his music, but his soul. The music school's auditorium was packed. Extra chairs had been brought in, and still, many people remained standing, eager to witness what promised to be an unforgettable evening. The stage, simple with a black grand piano at its center, seemed to shine under the warm lights that illuminated it. There were flowers around, placed there by Sophie and the children, who couldn't stop smiling, proud of their mentor and friend. Luke, backstage, took deep breaths, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling in his chest. He knew that tonight was not just a concert. It was a closure, a rite of passage, proof that he had transformed his pain into something beautiful and shareable. It was his way of honoring Helena, Matthew, Jane, Sophie, and all the people who had touched his life. Sophie approached, holding his hand for a moment before he stepped onto the stage. "You're ready," she said, her voice calm and full of conviction. "This music you're going to play isn't just for them, Luke. It's for you. It's your story, your heart. Let it speak for you." Luke nodded, feeling the truth in her words. He approached the curtain, taking another deep breath, and then took the final step onto the stage. The murmurs of the audience instantly ceased, replaced by an expectant silence that felt almost tangible. The auditorium's lights were soft, bathing Luke in a warm glow as he approached the piano. He sat down on the bench, adjusting his position, and then looked out at the audience. For a moment, his eyes met Jane's, who was seated in the front row, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes shining with a mix of tears and pride. Beside her, Sophie smiled with silent encouragement, and beyond them, he felt the presence of Helena and Matthew, not as ghosts, but as living memories, parts of himself that were now at peace. Luke closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the journey he had traveled flow through him. When he opened his eyes again, it was with renewed determination. He placed his fingers on the keys, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The first note sounded like a whisper, soft and full of promise. It was a solitary note, but laden with meaning, like the beginning of a deep conversation that was about to unfold. And then, Slowly, the melody began to emerge, gaining body and form as Luke played, each note intertwining with the next, creating a sonic tapestry that seemed to transcend time itself. The music was a journey in itself. It began with a soft lament, a tribute to pain and loss, but soon transformed into something more, a celebration of life, of resilience, of love. There were moments when the notes seemed to dance, light as leaves in the wind, and others when they became heavy, laden with emotion, as if they carried the weight of the world. The audience was completely absorbed, many with tears silently streaming down their faces, others with their eyes closed, lost in the music that seemed to speak directly to each of them. Sophie, watching from the side, felt immense pride, knowing that Luke had found his voice, his true voice, and was now sharing that discovery with the world. As Luke played, he felt as if he were flying, as if each note lifted him above his pain, his fears, everything that had held him back in the past. He wasn't just playing a piano. He was playing his soul, exposing it to the world without fear, without reservation. And as the music reached its climax, Luke felt a freedom he had never known before. When the final note sounded, reverberating in the air like a final sigh, there was a moment of absolute silence. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, absorbing the last drop of that transcendent experience. And then, almost like a wave breaking on the shore, the applause began, soft at first, then growing into an explosion of claps and cheers that filled the auditorium. Luke stood up, breathless, but with a smile that shone as brightly as the stage lights. He took a bow, but deep down, he knew that it wasn't just him being applauded. It was the journey, the struggle, the pain, and the triumph. It was the music he had created, music that now belonged to everyone who had heard it. When he returned backstage, Sophie was there, waiting for him with a hug that seemed to encapsulate all the moments of support, all the words of encouragement. "You did it, Luke," she whispered in his ear, holding him tightly. "You've been reborn." And as the auditorium lights began to dim and the audience slowly dispersed, Luke felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was complete. He had faced his shadows, transformed his pain into something more, and now he was ready for whatever the future held. The concert was over, but the music, that would never stop playing. If you like this story, please leave a like. And this other video that's appearing on the screen now will probably touch your heart too. Enjoy, and see you in the next video.